Muy bien, buenos días. Vamos a dar comienzo a la presentación de este informe y vamos a empezar poniendo un vídeo de seguridad, aunque la mayoría ya conocéis bien esto. Hemos hecho un vídeo de 1 minuto para que sepáis si hay algún problema donde está, que es aquí. Yo creo que esto es bueno para las aulas y para estas cosas. Por tanto, Isabel, ponlo, vamos a hacerlo.
Bienvenidos al Club Español de la Energía. Para garantizar su seguridad durante este acto, les ofrecemos un conjunto de indicaciones para la evacuación del edificio en cualquier situación de emergencia. Les rogamos presten atención.
Está completamente prohibido utilizar las salidas de emergencia salvo en caso de evacuación. Si descubre un incendio, mantenga la calma. Accione el pulsador de alarma más próximo y avisa al personal del club, y ellos le prestarán ayuda de inmediato e instrucciones precisas de cómo actuar. Si fuera necesario evacuar el recinto, se activará la sirena de alarma, seguida de un mensaje de megafonía ordenando la evacuación con rapidez, pero de manera ordenada y con calma. Diríjanse a la salida de emergencia más próxima. En ningún caso, utilicen los ascensores ni intenten acceder a los vehículos del aparcamiento subterráneo. Tendremos en cuenta la posibilidad de que personas con discapacidad o con movilidad reducida precisen de nuestra ayuda. Una vez en el exterior del recinto, diríjanse al punto de reunión más cercano, como muestra la imagen, situado en la parte trasera del edificio. No volveremos al edificio hasta que la emergencia haya sido solventada y tengamos la confirmación de los equipos de alarma y evacuación. Es importante no volver atrás. No olviden silenciar sus teléfonos móviles. Desde el Club Español de la Energía, esperamos que el evento sea de su agrado. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, ya lo habéis oído. Vamos a hacer esta sesión en inglés y por tanto we are going to change to English. And thank you for coming. This is a pleasure having all of you here. We are going to present this report, World Energy Investment 2019, by Alessandro Blasi and Alberto Toril. This is the third time they are coming here to present this report. This report is free of charge. You can download from the agency. You can see this presentation here in our web. No, you can download from our web this presentation. This is a resume of this presentation. Well, this is a very interesting report. This analyze the trends, as you could see after this, and the implication of the Paris Agreement Accord, a Paris Agreement, of all of this, and R&D and all these areas of the world investment. I think this is very, you can ask Alberto and Alessandro whatever you want at this presentation for this side. Well, Alessandro is the principal of this report. He joined the INA in 2009. Now he's the special counselor for Mr. Birol in that relationship with the private companies, a body formed in the IIA to support all this data, all these forecasts in the future for the private companies. And before that, he was involved in working in the Italian government. He's pleased to come here. Thank you, Alessandro, for coming and for answer whatever question you have. Alberto Toril, he's Spanish, as you can see. He's ingeniero industrial. He worked 2 years, more or less 1.5 years as a secondary in the International Energy Agency. Before he was in Iberdrola, and he's supporting Alessandro in this report. Both of them are open to answer whatever question you have at the end of their presentation. Alessandro and Alberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arcadio, and good morning, everybody. Apologize that it's my fault that today is in English in all the room, but as an Italian I can understand Spanish, but I have more difficulties in speaking, so apologize. As Arcadio said, I mean, it's a big pleasure to be back, and not only the third time we come here, but it's also the second time in a row that this is the first international presentation. The first presentation we are doing internationally. Many will follow in different parts of the world, but it's good to be here as a first place. So I will do the first part of presentation, Alberto will do the second, and then I will make some conclusion. But I would like to kick off saying that the World Energy Investment Report, differently from many other IEA reports, is not an outlook. It's trying to provide you a complete picture of what is happening today in the world energy system. So where the money are going, where the money are coming from, in what sectors are investors invested, in what technologies, what are emerging business models that we intercept here and there, and in a looking forward indication, what does this mean for the evolution of the energy system. This is the framework in which we have developed the World Energy Investment Report. So the first thing we try to look at is what is the global energy investment budget and how this has changed compared to the previous year. So the first message is in 2018, the global energy investment stabilized. It's the first time since we have introduced this report. All the previous edition we have seen the investment declining every year. In 2018, this didn't happen. It stabilized. How much is $1.85 trillion, the total investment in the sector? That, to put in context, is slightly less than 2% of the global economy, global GDP. But the stabilization of the investment, maybe surprisingly, came because increased the investment in the traditional part of the energy system. So more investment in oil, gas, and coal, which was that offset less investment in, for instance, in the power sector. Now, looking one by one, I start with the small one, but in my view, one of the most important to look at. The investment in renewables outside the power sector. Everyone speaks of renewables in power, wind, solar, and so on. But electricity is 20% of the global energy mix, 20%. You have another 80%. And when you look at renewables, in the two fundamental components outside power, so transport and heat, those remain negligible. Heat, the production of heat, is 50% of the total final energy consumption. 50. And basically, renewables there doesn't exist. In transport, we had some increase of investment in biofuels. We are speaking of something still very marginal and very far from what we needed, but this was more than offset by less investment in solar thermal heat. This is the reason why we had this decline. But the 1% decline is not particularly meaningful. The problem is the level of investment in renewables outside the power sector, which remains extremely negligible. Number one. Number two, coal. For the first time since we have introduced the report, the investment in coal supply means mining and associated infrastructure, increased 2%. But again, this needs to be contextualized. Is an increase? Yes. Is alarming? Yes. But is mainly to keep level of production of coal stable. Is not to expand the new coal mining and so on. Number two is an increase of 2%, but is still half of the level of investment we had at the beginning of the decade. It was more than the double, the total investment coal supply, but still they increased. So this gives you a different perception. Everyone called divestment, and no one is looking at coal anymore. Sorry, it's still the number one source of electricity production in the world. By far the number one. By far. And in the global energy mix, it is the number two energy sources after oil. Coal is still the king. Like it or not, is still very, very present in many parts of the world. And it looks like, as we will see later, that might stay since for a while. Investment in energy efficiency. For the first time since we did the report, the investment in energy efficiency did not increase. They stabilized in 2018. And this is very much connected to efforts or emphasis that are put on policies. We need more emphasis from government in applying standards, efficiency standards, building codes and so on, especially in buildings, because buildings is the most important sector for energy efficiency in terms of investment, but also in transport. We have a lot of good and welcome efficiency standards for cars, but we are much less developed in energy efficiency standards for trucks, which are the number one source with petrochemical of oil demand growth. The oil demand growth doesn't come from cars. It comes from trucks, it comes from petrochemicals, it comes from aviation and so on. Oil and gas, we had an increase, not very strong, but we had mainly an increase in upstream sector, as we will see a moment, driven by US and shale in 2018. Still, the total amount of investment in the upstream sector is about 300 billion lower than the peak we had in 2014. Today is $500 billion is invested in upstream sector. But here the story is also that the upstream industry has completely rebased in terms of cost following the crisis we had in 2014. And last but not least, power sector, despite a decline, which is connected to thermal power but also to renewables investment, retained for the third year in a row the number one position in terms of sectorial investment. Now keep in mind that more or less in the entire energy history, oil and gas has been always, or fossil fuel, let's say, has been always the number one for investment. Since 3 years, the number one is power. But this gives you an indication of the electrification of our economies, where we are going. So overall, this is what happened in terms of fuels and sectors. A bit of geographical color. What country attract most of the investment? Unsurprisingly, is China. But China was not the number one in the world until a few years ago. It was United States a few years ago. Then China took the throne mainly as the development, the tumultuous development of its power sector, grids, distribution, and so on. This number one position remains, but what we have seen over the last 2 years is that the gap with the United States is narrowing, because United States are accelerating investment and is shale, but is also grids. The investment in grids in the United States have been increasing pretty strongly. While in China, we had, for instance, a slowdown of investment in renewables, mainly solar, PV, because the government changed the policy. The Chinese government considered the level of a feed-in tariff that was in place in China too generous, and they made some adjustment, and this slowed down, at least in 2018, and we will see for 2019, the level of investment in China. For the rest of the country, we have seen some variation year versus year. It's not nothing particularly relevant. It's mainly for many places like Russia, or like Middle East, or also like Africa, is mainly function of the trend in oil and gas sector, which is continuing to rebound from the lows that was reached in 2016, but there's been no particularly or notable changes year versus year. Of course, what remains impressive is, for instance, in Africa, the level of investment for a continent so big and so densely, I would say, populated, at least in certain parts, where the level of investment remains well below what would be needed to give access to everyone electricity, considering we still have more than 1 billion without electricity access in Africa, or to give decent energy standards. Now, as I mentioned before, one thing we have been trying to look at in the world energy investment is what is happening, how companies are reacting to technology, policy, and market changes. Technology changes because, of course, there is a lot of cost development across technologies. There is new ones that are becoming promising or that they are starting to develop. Market changes because we have seen prices, roller coaster of prices over the last few years, and the policy changes because, of course, everyone is aware that we are well far from any sustainable trajectory. So people expect policies that could increase or could affect the demand for own fuel. So how companies are reacting to this context? And the answer is that the companies in the energy sector, there is a shifting toward shorter cycle projects. So a shift towards projects that are able to return the investment as quick as possible. Or at least that you are able, after a limited amount of time, to recover your cost and then start to gain on your investment. One example is oil and gas. In oil and gas you have two shifts. Number one, you have a significant part of upstream investment that has been diverted towards shale. The shale sector, few years ago, was responsible for few percentage points of the total upstream investment. Last year it was 25%. Why? Of course, you have cost of development, you have access to resources, you have many reasons. But also you have that the shale industry operates in month time scale. But again, we need to contextualize. Shale is headline everywhere. But shale is today, after many development, 8 million barrels per day. We consume more than 100 million barrels per day. So you have other 92. And this is the conventional industry. So the traditional Middle East, Russia, onshore, offshore, shelf, deep water projects. So the conventional. The conventional industry has been always something working in multi-years, in decades. Again, in the conventional industry, what we see is that the companies try to simplify project, redesign, standardize when is possible, in order to minimize the time from FID to the first drop of oil produced or the first molecule of gas produced. Also, as the IEA, we have the privilege to not being a commercial organization and to be an institution. We have the privilege to speak on individual basis with many companies. and to get the sense of, at the executive level, what is happening. And the sense we get is that in the board of directors, there is more and more discussion between, okay, we have now the list of projects that we can sanction. We go for this one that it gives an IRR of 20%, but it took 10 years before we recover the upfront investment. Or we go for a project that gives an IRR of 15% or 10%, but it takes 5 years before we recover the investment. And we understand there is a shift towards getting the one that you gain less, but you get the money first back. Of course, the perfect situation is when you gain a lot and you get the money back earlier. I mean, this is of course obvious. But in relative terms, there is this kind of readjustment. But this is not only oil and gas, it's also power. And here is mainly a technology shift. What we see is that the renewables were responsible in 2010 for 45% of the total investment in power generation. In 2018 is 65%. So and in the meantime, the investment in thermal power has halved to 25%. So you have a shift in technology, and also you have that thanks to auctions, cost reduction, and learning by doing, the project gets shorter, especially in those countries where you have good context and good regulatory framework. So the message is, overall, what we see is that the energy industry, since the beginning of the decade overall, has been able to improve the speed in executing projects by around 20%. So you have an industry that, for having always been shaped by long-term trajectory, long-term period, still remains a long lead times industry, but is becoming shorter. And the main reason is to reduce the exposure of own capital at risk, because it's very sensitive to market changes, sensitive to government regulation, many different aspects. Now, another thing we have tried this year for the first time is to integrate a bit the snapshot of what is happening today with where are we going compared to the level of investment we are doing. So we tried to address two simple but basic questions. Number one, are we investing enough? Number two, are we investing in a way that is consistent with our energy security and sustainability goals? This has been the two questions we posed to ourselves. Number one, no. The answer is no. Whatever scenario you consider. Here are MPS and SDS, our two main IA scenarios, that making in a very concise way. The NPS is the one more or less business as usual, where energy demand is growing strongly, and the SDS is the one consistent with the Paris Agreement goals, as well as other sustainable development goals like access and air pollution. So whatever scenario you consider here, is evident we are not investing enough. As far as the second question, is this consistent with security? Is this consistent with sustainability? Here we have to enter a bit more into details, but the answer is no. When we look at fuel supply, we need a reallocation of the spending. We need more investment in biofuels, more investment in gas, and much less investment in coal. For oil, I will be back in a moment in the next slide. And for sustainability, in the power sector, we need a reallocation further than an increase of the money spent. Renewables. In 2018, the investment has been in the order of 300 billion. We need a double to be consistent with the sustainability trajectory. We need to go to 600 billion. And this despite, of course, the scenario consider a continuous reduction of cost in renewables. But we need also more investment in nuclear. Now, this is a point that the IEA has to do. It's very difficult to imagine worldwide level that you can reach the Paris goal without nuclear. It depends. Every country has the right to do what they want, but the low carbon contribution from nuclear is not easy to replace. In terms of terawatt hours, many people speak in terms of capacity, but 1 gigawatt of nuclear is not 1 gigawatt of solar. Has to be considered further to integration and so on. And of course we need more spending in network. So the message is, whatever angle you look, we are storing up risk for our future. And we definitely need a complete reversal of proportion of investment in low carbon. If you put low carbon all together, include renewables, include nuclear, but include also energy efficiency, today the share is about 1/3 of the total. In the sustainable development scenario, you need the opposite. You need 2/3 of low carbon, 1/3 of the rest, while today you have 1/3 of low carbon and 2/3 of the rest. So you need to revert. This is a clear mess. Now, in terms of security, oil and gas, now we try to dive a bit more into the single area. The reaction of the oil and gas industry to the crisis in 2014 has been a significant decline of new projects that has been approved. So when we look not in terms of money, but in terms of the physical volume, we have seen that over the last 3 years, the amount of sanctioned resource halved compared to the previous part. So again, the question is this enough compared to what we need? The answer depends on which scenario you are considering. In the MPS, where the demand is continuing to strongly grow, we need an acceleration of investment. In the sustainable development scenario, the current level of investment is more or less fine, but we have a problem. We have the supply, according to this, aligned with the Paris trajectory, but the demand on the market is aligned with MPS. So, or we accelerate the investment, or we have a problem of availability. This is, for gas, is even stronger. Whatever scenario you consider, you need more investment in gas. And this is because, as IEA said, the gas demand is performing, of course, worldwide level, in a very, very good way. 2018 has been a golden year for gas. Almost 5% increase, global level. Is amazing. United States alone increased the gas consumption in 2018 of 80 BCM. But also China. China is growing very strong, I would say in this case, thankfully, because it's trying to improve the air quality and to replace as much as possible coal with gas. And with gas, I would finish my part to pass to Alberto saying, let's look also what is happening on LNG, which is particularly important. In LNG, we have seen in the first part of the decade 2 waves of new projects coming. First, Australia, with the big ones, the big mega projects, Gorgon and the other, based on coal bed methane resources exploitation. And in the second part of the first half of decade, it started to come into the picture the fact of the shale gas revolution in the United States. But then it came the crisis. So we had the crisis, we had the collapse of prices, so we had the gas glut as a legacy of the previous investment done, and we had the picture frozen. No investment, no energy. And in the meantime, what happened? Demand continued to grow very strongly. So what we have seen now is that so far, since last year, we had 4 new LNG projects sanctioned, 3 out of 4 are in North America. But even more importantly, there is a long list of projects that are in the verge to be sanctioned. The chart shows you what is happening today, as of today. But Qatar expansion is behind the corner. Exxon has anticipated that it will take FID for Mozambique by the end of this year. Russia is going strong with the Arctic 2 LNG, another huge, and other projects here and there. So what we say is, looking at the previous chart, where there is a scope for more gas needed, and looking this one is 2019 might end up to be an interesting year for the approval and the development of new gas infrastructure. Taking also into account that in 2019 we expect, according the finalization of Nord Stream from Russia in the north, the finalization of TAG Stream from Russia to Europe, the finalization of Power of Siberia from Russia to China, and other smaller projects here and there. So gas seems to be in a good position as a demand and as investment to try to lock itself for the energy future. Alberto, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alessandro. So now we will take the chance to move to another part of the energy sector, which is the power. And for the next 3-4 slides, we will be talking about very interesting trends that we found in this year in the report. So let's start talking to what happened with the coal-fired plants and the sanction capacity during these years. So we start analyzing the coal-fired final investment decisions, which is a leading indicator of investment in the power sector, and we see that they decline near the lowest level this century to nearly 20 gigawatts. That means which is around 10% of what happened, 80% lower than what happened in 2010. So this drop has been led by 2 countries, basically. In one side it was China, spurred by overcapacity in the market and local pollution concerns, and at some extent India, where the distribution companies faced lower utilization rates from the asset that in many cases left them stranded in the power system. On the other side, we have the global retirements, which has been mainly in the US and in Europe, by 3 main reasons, basically. The first one is the capacity reaching the end of the economical lifetime of the plants. Second, the competition that brings the revenues, both the revenues and utilization down from the plants. And in the first situation is the impact of policies tackling the local air pollution concerns. But despite these trends, the global coal-fired fleet continued to grow in 2018 by 8 gigawatts globally. But we've seen a mismatch from where this new capacity is being added and this old capacity is being retired. So we have developing Asian countries where where the coal fleet continued to expand by 35 gigawatts last year, albeit at the slowest pace of the decade. And in the other side, the rest of the world has been seeing a declining sanctioning of projects since 2012. I am sorry. So what are the implications of this investment in the low carbon environment? And I will start picking by some of these additions in the coal plants. So this continued investment in coal-fired plants, which normally they have a long life cycle, appear to be aiming a growing gap between the sharing of demand for power and a leveling off of the expected generation that comes from the low carbon sources. Here, I mean, as everyone knows, we only took into consideration not only the renewable but as well the nuclear. So the first message that we see here is, despite a very good progress of solar PV and wind in the recent years, with the overall stagnation of renewable investment coming from these low carbon sources, and the reduced role of hydropower, the expected generation coming from them, I mean, it's leveling off. And this is as well consistent with the data that was released by the agency 2 weeks ago, showing a stalling of the renewable capacity additions in last year. This is also reinforced by the reduced expansion of the nuclear power investment, as we were saying, particularly outside China, which has underpinned much of this growth in recent years. Then, if we compare to the electricity demand growth, that soared in 2018, as we are seeing, by nearly 4%, a message that the IEA already communicated in the GECO report, in the Global Energy and CO2 Status in March. We are seeing this demand growth on electricity rocking up, and I have to comment here that the first time we made this with this analysis was in the first edition of the World Energy Investment in 2016. We had a totally different expectation of how the following year would look like. As everyone knows, 2015 was the year where the Paris Agreement was made and all the commitment from the member countries. But the picture we have nowadays is totally different. And this is unfortunately being filled by investments in coal and gas instead. So what happens if we compare this to what we need in the future? So to both scenarios in the IEA. So it's clear that we will need a sizable reallocation of capital towards this low carbon supply. But because of the accelerated needs from the Sustainable Development Scenario, which compiles with the Paris Agreement, we will need a doubling of renewable spending, much more investment in nuclear, as we were pointing previously, amid a rising level of spending as well in electricity networks. Very important. Jump to this. So in this slide, we will analyze firstly what's the role of this investment on renewables within a sector of corporate PPAs. So first of all, what we've seen is like even overall renewable investment declined somewhat in 2018, we were commenting. We see evolving trends in the underlying business model for the renewable projects. And first of all, to comment that up to date, nearly all utility scale projects have been benefited from long-term prices under policy schemes that benefit them, such as, for example, feed-in tariffs in many places of the world. Increasingly competitive auctions for long-term contracts, which help to hedge risk as well in the long term. And on the other side, in many cases, from physical PPAs with utilities that were subject to purchase obligations. But recently, there is a growing trend of these corporations to procure additional renewable power directly, independently from the government plans. And to satisfy this demand, there are new contractual structures that are emerging to help these corporations to demonstrate the clear additionality on their portfolio and to provide at the same time a certain degree of price certainty for the renewable developers to hedge and to develop these projects. So we had renewable investment based on corporate PPAs jumping by 1/3 last year, reaching a level of around $15 billion all around the world. That, to make a comparison, this is around 5% of the global investment in the both combined wind and solar PV. So the United States, as we can see in the chart on the left, has been the market leader for this, spearheaded by companies such as Facebook, Microsoft, and even ExxonMobil, which has made this type of agreements. We've seen this trend as well with the business model start to take off in Europe, but nevertheless, the evolution and the deployment, remains more limited in other parts of the world. So, where these corporate PPAs have been growing the most? So, first of all, corporate PPAs have been growing in markets where there are clear regulations to facilitate the contracting and the reselling of power, specifically from utilities that are able to provide altogether billing, balancing, and physical delivery services, as well as certificates that can really prove and demonstrate this additionality from companies. And for example, in the United States, we've seen the renewable tax credits really enhancing and really promoting the use of corporate PPAs by companies. So if we take a look now on what's the real impact on the energy from these corporate PPAs, we've seen that a much larger scale of spending is needed for these corporate PPAs to make more of a dent of the both combined commercial and industrial power demand. So we will need a 7-fold growth of cumulative spending to cover at least the 10% of this commercial and industrial power demand in both the US and the Europe combined. So that suggests that we will be tapping into a much larger pool of corporate buyers, which can raise additional challenge as well in terms of credit risk evaluation for the projects and new ways of project structuring. And just to mention that we have more detail on this financial analysis in the report this year, where we one of the key themes that we analyze is the different financial risk management strategies beyond the subsidies that the developers are taking right now. With all of this discussion of renewable projects subsidy freeze in the north part of Europe on the table, and the different type of hedge that the corporations are utilizing right now to provide certainty. So now I will come back and we will talk about this renewable investment from a project finance perspective. And here the distinction that we have and the categorization that we have on sources of finance for new projects, it's from one side we try to categorize them into balance sheet financing and project financing for projects. So the first message that we've seen here is like around 85% of the project, the power investment, it was financed from the balance sheet of utilities, independent power producers, and even customers in the case of distributed generation. But we are seeing that the role of project finance for new projects has grown in recent years, with the largest contribution now in the utility scale renewable power sector. So project finance plays significant role in the United States that have grown in recent years. There's been recent even change on the tax code, that has not even undermined the availability of tax equity for wind and solar PV. In Europe, we've seen project financing for offshore quite stable, but the picture is completely different from offshore projects, where thanks to the maturity of the technology and lowering risks, in many cases thanks to this competitive bidding for long-term contracts, and in places where we've seen the system operators assuming the connection for the grid, they've been growing up. So just to as well take the opportunity here, like that we will have the World Energy Outlook report coming in November, and there is a special chapter this year on the wind onshore, where we will analyze more in depth as well this trend, but how the market is taking off and how it will evolve in the future. And last but not least, I will speak here about a completely different piece of analysis that the IEA managed to put together thanks to the contribution of the different member countries, which are able to provide annual data of its global spending on R&D. And even if this trend is not part of the global trend of energy investment that we saw in the report, spending on R&D is essential for the development of some of the new technologies that the energy system will be looking towards to support the investment in the future. So we've seen that global spending, governments all around the world spend around $28 billion on energy R&D, which suggests a 5%, sustained 5% increase in the last years. But trying to establish a way of benchmarking this and to understand if this is a lot or this is not less, we make a comparison with the GDP. So we stick to how the spending is compared as a share of the GDP for different countries, and here the trend is completely different. It's flat for the last 5 years. So we had that despite China, who was the country in absolute terms that spent the most on renewable and higher performing fossil fuel technologies on R&D, the rest of the countries are not spending more than the economic output of them. So as well, we see that this is striking when we are trying to compare to other business, so what's the private sector doing, and we have that just 2 of the leading European automakers has spent last year more of their economical output in R&D than the combined budget of all around the world. So with that, I'll just leave the floor to Ale to go through the conclusions.
Thank you. So, to put together the few thoughts together, just let me say one thing before. As Alberto said, that there is much more there. We have made a new version this year in order also to try to be more user-friendly. So this year, the World Energy Investment Report is not a report in traditional way, but it's 175 slides, charts and commented, in order to have a format that can be better used. It's publicly available on the website, so there is much more that of course cannot be described in just a presentation. To put the thing in context, we have seen what is the total budget of the energy investment in 2018. The news is, are we going in the right direction? On how this is compared to what it used to be before. And here there is an interesting comparison to do, which is, let's keep in mind, 30 years ago, a former Prime Minister of Norway, Madame Brundtland, has been the one that has introduced the concept of sustainable development to mainly change the energy mix, to change the importance of fossil fuel. And at that time, the share of fossil fuel in the global energy mix was 81%. And we had few millions of meetings, trillions of miles flew around the world to meet. We had probably deforestation of some important places in the world to write new laws and new policy. And in 2018, the share of fossil fuel is 81%, still. With also another problem, that is an 81% of a much bigger cake compared to 30 years ago. So the problem is, we are not going the right direction, and the investment that we have described now are not giving any relief. The chart Alberto showed in terms of associated low carbon generation from the investment today and the electricity demand trend means, in very practical terms, that we have an interesting increase of the share of renewable in the energy mix as a percentage, but we have more and more fossil fuel terawatt hour to meet the electricity demand. This is the number. Number two, the context, the arena for the energy industry players is changing. It's becoming much shorter, and if you are among those that has to decide to put money out of your pocket in a project or the others, you need to be, in my view, extremely well informed of what is happening. Because the scenario might change pretty quickly, and your investment could perform as expected or could not perform at all as you expected, according to the evolution. But there are other implications of this, which is that if the energy industry is looking at the shorter term, the security of supply becomes a tricky exercise between governments, the policymakers, the energy industry, because the time horizon that they work is not aligned perfectly anymore. So here, probably, or maybe selfish, there is a role for institutions like IEA to put the different pieces together, at least to inform properly the component. The energy security is a concept very much associated with oil and gas. Today I think it's important to expand also to electricity nowadays, because as our economies are electrifying. But let's stick to the tradition. In the oil and gas sector, we do not see the level of investment activities strong enough in a scenario like it is today, unfortunately, of strong demand growth. Because unless we hope for an economic crisis, which I don't believe anyone is hoping for that, there are no signs of slowdown in energy demand, especially of traditional fossil fuel. So this is something to keep in mind and to be aware of. I would also add that, and I'm repeating something I repeated a couple of years ago, that in 2014, 15, 16, when the price collapsed, many people celebrated the financial difficulties of the oil and gas companies. Most of those have done very well the homework, squeezing efficiency out, changing the cost structure. And now those companies are pretty well equipped to stay on the market. So, in other words, who was celebrating the difficulties of the enemy, or considered by those as such, well, maybe today might change idea. Now, as far as concerns the allocation of the capital, as I said, basically today we have 1/3 of investment going in low carbon and 2/3 the opposite, and 2/3 in the rest. The sustainable trajectory, you need to reverse this proportion. 2/3 in low carbon and 1/3 in the rest. But here I would add another thing. Probably the father of all international treaties on climate change is Kyoto Protocol. It was 97. And in 97, the share of low carbon was 37%. Today is 36. And why? And I think it's even more impressive of the 81% we said before. But why? Because all the boom we had in wind and solar, which is very, very, very welcome, don't misinterpret me, has basically offset an 8% decline, percentage point lost, for nuclear. This is the number. So still we are at that. And last but not least, we emphasize that, we said last year, 95% of the investment are basically government-driven in the energy sector. And as such, our future is shaped by the policy and the policy framework that are decided by government today. Because, as we said, we have a different trajectory we can follow, which has different implications. With this, we will be happy. Thanks for the attention. Apologize if we were a bit long, but we are passionate about our work, and we are open for questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Alessandro and Alberto. It was an outstanding presentation as always. No? This is the third time we see all of this. And you can download these 70 slides from the web, and you can test this one. Well, it's a little bit not positive, this trend we are following.
I mean, it depends. I mean, I agree. It's not positive. It's also a matter of, if you want, it's a personal attitude. It is a glass half empty or half full. I believe is more empty than full.
Yeah, and you have changed the system. Before you were talking a lot about the corporate financing and project financing, and now you were focusing on project financing and PPA and all of this, because you have seen that is the trend. This is more for Alberto.
Well,
no, I can.
Yeah, well, we are seeing evolving trends on this, thanks to the lower capital cost for renewables in many places, and as well the climate policies that are changing right now. For example, in Europe, we have all the commitments for 2030 that are pushing to phase out coal in many places. So PPAs and this kind of modeling structure for hedge the risk of this declining cost on renewables and taking out. Nevertheless, as Alessandro as well was repeating, I mean, we see a stagnation of overall investment in renewables. That's not helping. And even though still we are having that governments, 95% of overall investment in power supply, I mean, it's ruled by governments and it's ruled by regulations, which in the end determines that even though this is growing, it's still very little compared to the overall picture of the renewable investment.
Okay. Keep in mind data, because the data is, I mean, everyone has an opinion. And then, but the data are numbers, so this is something we try to base on. 2018 is the first year in the last 2 decades where the annual renewable capacity addition did not grow. We had 177 gigawatt of new renewable addition in the world, of all technology, which was the same of the year before. In all the previous 20 years, every year was beating the year before.
Increasing.
Just to say, this is the number. So one thing is looking at the money, for instance, $300 billion. If you look in cost-adjusted terms, they buy 55% capacity more than a few years back because the cost went down, so it's very good. So sometimes the money tells you something, sometimes the money don't tell you enough. But the problem we're saying is, instead of having an acceleration of the growth, we had a flattening. And there was now, of course, China changing policy in solar had a factor, but it's not only that, you know what I mean. It's a matter also that in many parts of the world, Europe, the land use in certain cases or the social acceptance in other has moved from thermal also to renewables. I mean, we have. I live in France. We have problems in the offshore wind because, for touristic reasons, it's not good to have the windmills on the horizon. You have this kind of problem. So you do not want coal. You do not want nuclear. The windmills are not beautiful enough.
I will do.
No?
Okay. Questions for them, if you would like to make some question to them, Alessandro, Alberto, whatever. Okay, it's open. Please introduce yourself and make a question. Put a question.
Hi, my name is Alberto. I'm from Spain. I've seen you've made a lot of comments about the supply of coal, gas, and oil. And I'm wondering, have you found any data about the fuel for nuclear, so the fuel for the uranium market? Have you found any data?
Well, the investment in uranium fuel mining is extremely limited. It's peanuts. It's not a big market. And also, I mean, I would say something that is not particularly relevant also from a security supply point of view, because the uranium is a resource that is quite, not perfectly, but is quite well distributed. If you compare the amount of nuclear fuel that is needed for, of course, energy resources, and associated activities for uranium mining, there is no particular problem on that. So, yeah.
Some more questions to them? Okay, we have two, one at the back and one here.
Hola, buenas. Si no les importa, voy a formular en castellano la pregunta y luego se lo traducen a él, si no les importa. Es muy rápido sobre el tema de la guerra entre China y Estados Unidos, que creo que no se ha tratado en ningún momento, y las consecuencias que podría tener al sector energético y más concretamente al ámbito petrolero. Sí,
¿Te puedes presentar?
Sí, Tony Acuña de la cadena SER, perdón.
I mean, I think this goes outside the IA mandate. I mean, I don't believe there is any relationship between the US and China trade disputes and the oil situation. I think that is evident in any newspaper that the disputes between the US and China are connected to the balance of payment between the two countries and some technologies. Personally, I haven't seen anything related to oil, but yeah, so this is my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander and Alberto. It's very clear your presentation. Very clear your presentation, and thank you very much for that. Yes, my question was regarding with renewables. You can talk more regarding with the split between wind, photovoltaic solar, or thermosolar. What are the trends that you guess in your report?
Well, I can say a couple of things, but for last year, I mean, we didn't see any evolving trends in the overall wind additions. It's true that in Europe there is a change of trend, and the investment was split half by half in between onshore and offshore, and it's clear that offshore is taking off. But on the overall capacity addition remain flat. As we were discussing as well, overall capacity additions as well of solar remain flat, and then because of the cost going down, prices, final investment went down as well. Outside China, solar PV in total world growth a little bit, between 3 and 4%. But as I was saying, they are very linked to the policy changes, and on the second half of the year, due to this push to auctions model scheme and going away from the feed-in tariffs, the overall investment went down. Forecast for the next year could be different, but there is still some uncertainty on how the investment look like. That's more or less the picture on both of them.
I think, I mean, just to supplement, I think that one interesting trend to look at is the testimony in wind is moving from onshore to offshore. And if I were an European, I would, I am an European, but I say if I were in a different position, I would keep trying to keep the leadership in the offshore wind. It's a technology that is very promising. So far has been mainly a European story, but you see the sign that is spreading over the world. For instance, the numbers are lower, but China offshore wind investment increased 50% last year, and this is moving in as far as the US. So I would say that you have also an appetite in offshore wind in terms of industry development. You see a significant number of oil and gas service companies that are trying to recycle them into companies that can provide the services for the offshore wind industry, because you need the installation of those is not exactly like the development on offshore field in oil and gas, but you need certain competencies and certain technologies to work offshore that at least mindset are similar. So this is important. You mentioned solar thermal. Solar thermal investment is basically purely a China story in the numbers, and we have seen this going down a bit in China over the last year. I am honest with you, I don't know the reason, but just to say that this went down a bit last year in the solar thermal over there. For the solar thermal, not the PV. PV is what is covered. Yeah.
Any more questions to them? Or two more questions here. The last two questions. In the back, this guy. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Ignacio González. I'm the Business Development Director of Dura Felguera. You said that in 2018 there has been an establishment of the PV sector renewables have not raised. Would it be the explanation of this battle of prices, especially in the national auctions, where the IPPs are very aggressive and then they have serious problems in raising the financing for the project?
Yes, well, yes, I mean, there is a... Hello? There is a clear... Yes, it's working, I think. It's true that there is a clear trend going to more competitive and wholesale market-operated revenues from many of these plants, which in the end are bringing the costs up. I mean, the risks up for many of the financing, in the way that financing cost of debt in many cases is going up. So it's not that easy to finance these projects that are going into wholesale. Nevertheless, the whole trend, as we were saying, this is not the big part of the cake of how the renewable investment it's looking like, but costs are going down in many places. It's a combination of both, and basically the fact that this change of policy in China, moving away from feed-in tariffs, that got the numbers a little bit downer really this year. As we were saying, in a cost-adjusted basis, so taking into account, for example, how the cost that we have in 2018 and bringing them back to 2010, there is a 55% of growth in the market in terms of investment on solar PV. It's, I don't know if you want to say something there.
No,
but
I mean, to me it's interesting.
It's the risk. Yeah.
I'm not an expert of the market, but I think it's interesting, especially for those operating renewables, that you are moving into, and it's not going to be easy, you are moving from an era where the industry, the renewable industry was operating in a subsidized context, to we are approaching, thanks God, a moment where the renewable industry will not be subsidized anymore, so the post-subsidy era. And this is not a trivial change in the mindset in terms of what are the returns, how eventually is going to change the cost of capital for financing. Because in the moment your business is completely safe, more or less, is one thing. Another thing is when these conditions are not anymore. Just to give an example at a very high level, we have analyzed the oil and gas versus the renewable sector in terms of cost of capital and return of investment. There is more into the report. And just looking at the cost of capital, I mean, the proportion is a 6, 7, 8 percentage point difference higher in oil and gas because it's risky compared to renewables. So the different mindset you need to face operating renewables and the culture and so on is something that needs to not be underestimated, at least as a coming trend.
Okay, the last question from Luis.
Yeah,
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, Luis Crespo for Puerto Solar. So thank you very much, Alessandro, and Alberto. I think it was an extremely important study, and I think it's very important that you raise these kind of messages. I think policymakers have to take decisions, otherwise, as you already said, the world can't be sustained at all. So this is is incredible that we are not following the right trend. My only concern is about some of your statements and focus on nuclear. And well, you know, in Spain we have already did a good exercise, and we are quite sure that we can substitute all nuclear power plants by renewables, hopefully with more contribution from dispatchable renewables. But anyhow, gas backup is enough. So I think we can rid of nuclear without any trouble, and nobody thinks in Spain and in many other countries that another nuclear power plant can be promoted. So this is a fact. And the fact is also that prices of renewables are by far, without subsidies today, much cheaper than nuclear in terms of price of energy, not in terms of power, in terms of energy. And also we are starting decommissioning nuclear power plants in Spain, and we are surprisingly seeing that the decommissioning costs are much more expensive than what thought in the past. Nobody knows exactly how much are going to cost to get rid of the wastes. And I don't know whether in the with these facts, I am really surprised about your focus on nuclear, and also I don't know whether somebody, United Nations or International Energy Agency, are taking into account the obvious correlation between the countries which are now pursuing nuclear power programs and countries that has perhaps a second idea about what they can do with nuclear power. There is a strong correlation about, if you put it in the focus, this kind of information, you will see that it is not by chance that most of the countries which are a little bit afraid that perhaps in the future they have to defend the territory, so they have to compete about the neighbors, they are just really putting nuclear powers into force. So I'm really surprised because of the price. Nuclear has nothing to do in the future with renewables, and about the costs that they are behind nuclear are unknown right now. And also, if you want to start a nuclear power plant today, nobody knows how much it's going to cost. Nobody knows how much it's going to last when the plant is finished. And nobody knows when, if the plan is finished.
Please finish. This is not an interview. This is a question. Okay.
So that's
all. Your position is more than legitimate. And again, don't misinterpret me in the sense that it really doesn't matter if I am pro or against nuclear. I mean, the IEA is all fuels and all technologies. And I come from a country that has banned the idea of nuclear. So, no, just to say, but there are facts that needs to be brought on the table. And it's a matter of what is the priority? The climate change or something else? When we look at the scenario, what we are saying is that to reach the climate targets without nuclear is feasible, but there is an heroic effect. It's also almost impossible to reach if you do not develop CCUS, where you have 2,000 gigawatt of coal in Asia, 2,000 gigawatt in Asia that is 11 years old, 11, so he's young, he's a baby, 2,000 gigawatt of coal. So it's not this, I'm not entering, I mean, any country is more than legitimate to make the choice about nuclear. We work as IEA with countries that are pro-nuclear, with countries that are considering their nuclear position, with countries that has banned the nuclear. But nuclear is a part of the energy mix, and the IEA cannot ignore nuclear. It's like some people that are particularly pro-renewable, which I am pro-renewable, but I speak of coal because it's 38% of electricity generation. Is number one by far. So I like it, I don't like it, it doesn't matter. I have to speak, I mean, I'm working for an institution. So what I'm saying is, to speak about nuclear is, let's not forget what is the thing. What is his contribution, and let's not forget that 1 gigawatt of nuclear is not 1 gigawatt of solar or wind. I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I'm saying that at home, when we switch off the light, we need the kilowatt hour, not the kilowatt. So this is something, just this, but please don't take IEA position as pro or against nuclear, or pro or against coal, or pro or against oil. Is what we have to provide, to tell to the policymaker, we are at 37% of low carbon in the energy mix, like 20 years ago, because wind and solar so far have just replaced nuclear decline. I like it, I don't like it. This is the number. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alessandro. And the Spanish government is considering in the plan for 2030 to maintain the nuclear capacity half, more or less. Okay, thank you very much to Alessandro and Alberto, and well, an applause for them. Okay, thank you for coming here.